You see me up here, but there are a few other people that are involved with the Academy, and they make the events happen. Mayona Urban was greeting at the door. Mickey Street is here. Not here tonight are Tom Kearns. I haven't seen him yet.
He's here outside. He's here.
Oh, there he is, way in the back. Dave Baldwin and Jerry Kimmel were the originators of the idea for the Academy. It's changed a little bit since then, but it's still operating and thriving. Dave was busy playing softball this afternoon, so he's probably blanked out. I wanted to announce that our video technician is doing 2 concerts, piano concerts, coming up a week from tomorrow, June 7th. He'll be in this room at 2 p.m. on Sunday. It's sponsored by the Friends of the Yachats Commons Foundation, and it's a benefit for the Ladies Club. The Ladies Club participated when the Friends were raising money for brand new stove and all kinds of equipment in the kitchen. So the Friends are reciprocating. The Ladies Club is trying to get a new oven stove unit in their building. And then again on June 28th at the Newport Performing Arts Center, benefit for the Oregon Council of the Arts. Now the Academy has a couple events coming up. And there's a little side story on this one. These are both for the same event. Does human sexuality have a history? Burgundy Featherkyle, who does all of our work on our posters, emailed me and says, asked if Dr. Robert and I had a sense of humor. She said she had some creative ideas for the posters and just didn't want to offend him. And my response to her was, anybody that selects human sexuality as their specialty for a college course has to have a sense of humor. You'd be in bad shape if you didn't. Anyway, Dr. Robert and I and Dr. Mary Jo and I have a house here in Yachats. They also are both professors at Oregon State University. And so Dr. Robert and I will be here Saturday, June 20th, 6:30 in the evening. And does human sexuality have a history as its topic? Now his wife has programs on the history of science, so we'll try and get her for next year sometime. She's already basically agreed to it. Then in July, we've changed this date so it didn't conflict with the Yachats Music Festival, which is the 10th, 11th, and 12th. So the following Saturday, Greg Scott, who we've enjoyed before, has a presentation on New Zealand. And he's made 2 trips over there, and he's combining all of his photos for one presentation. Now tonight is sort of a personal pleasure for me. I have the honor of being personal friends with Max Glenn and Marie Green. Max and I have lunch together on a very regular basis, and all kinds of topics get shared, including some of what he's going to share tonight. And at one point I said, Max, I said, the larger community needs to hear this. These are events that happen within our lifetime. We may have been real small or adults already, but these happened within the last 50, 60 years. So if we didn't know about them, we probably should have known about them. I said, maybe he'll do a presentation for the Arts Academy. No. Well, just like that. He said no. But I come from Finnish and Swedish background, and the first no means nothing. I persisted, and I asked him month after month after month. Finally, he agreed. So here we are tonight, my dear friend, Max Glenn.
Us Appalachians don't know what to do with this glass. Look what he put out here for me.
Is that water, Max?
It is. I knew I had made it. I was accepted when I went to a meeting up a holler. And of course, the first thing I was advised to do is get rid of the suit, tie, briefcase, everything else. But when I came back to the car and there was a quart fruit jar full of something clear in the driver's seat, I knew I'd made it.
It was a Yachats.
And I was advised to pour a little in the saucer and light a match. If it burns, drink it. If it won't burn, don't touch it. Don did lean on me real hard, and then he sort of blackmailed me into this date. But I've forgiven him. I guess it's okay after more than 14 years to get outed among friends. But tonight, as I look around, I feel kind of like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Well, I may be just a little bit nervous. I don't know. I've been fortunate to have a career that I just really love, to do things that I enjoy doing. I've been very fortunate to work with some really awesome people and to really be able to make a difference in the lives of people and in many communities. For more than 30 years, I managed faith-based, nonprofit organizations that were created to improve communities and work for social justice. Don, as he and the Academy tried to refine my 50 years of career into what I might talk about, suggested that I talk about organizing grassroots folks to participate in decision-making and lobbying while developing economic alternatives geared to the people and their culture. This kind of work can really be fun and rewarding, but it's also very frustrating. Tonight I'm going to share some of my experiences in human and civil rights in Appalachia in the 1960s, some of my experiences in human rights and civil rights in the school desegregation in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s, we were involved very deeply in civil and human rights in the farm crisis. And so I'm going to ask you, I don't do PowerPoints and all of this, so I'm going to ask you to be with me for mental imaging. So if you can't go back to creating mental images, you can leave now. But we're going to create some mental images. Someone says that Appalachia was developed each generation. It's rediscovered. And if you're interested in more than just a windshield survey, you'll find a region of great contrast when you think of Appalachia. Marjorie Hunter, in a New York Times article on Appalachian Portrait, mentioned the contrasts as swimming pools and surplus food handouts, luxurious mountain resorts and shacks on mine-stripped hills. The region stretches 1,000 miles from New York, lower tariff counties in New York State, down to the northern counties of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. At the time, I was director of rural churches and rural community development for the United States and Canada. And I thought, boy, that's great, zeroing in from the United States and Canada to only 13 states. But that's a long ways. Has anybody here walked that Appalachian Trail? I wouldn't be surprised. Somebody in Yachats had walked the Appalachian Trail, but I guess not. Well, you probably think of Central Appalachia, the core area of eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, southwest Virginia, and parts of West Virginia. You may think of the coal fields, you may think of the Hatfields and McCoys, you may think of the hillbillies. The church had a historic interest for the people living in Appalachia back in the 1800s. Churches brought the first schools, the first hospitals, medical clinics, all kinds of social services to the people of the mountains. My own denomination, the Christian Church Disciples, brought the first school in Wolfe County, Kentucky. A residential school. We're still pouring several $100,000 into that residential school. There was a new public school less than a mile down the road. So we had to face the question, should we still be putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into that residential school, or are there other things that we need to be doing? Other religious groups were asking the same question. The Presbyterians got ahead of us. They had a whole bunch of hospitals. And so they just turned the hospitals over to United Mine Workers and others. So in 1956, a group of church leaders got together to talk about how they could reassess their mission efforts. And so from those conversations, 15 religious bodies set up the Southern Appalachian Studies. They got funding from Ford Foundation. Yes, big foundations were doing some good things back in those days. And the professor of sociology at University of Kentucky, by the name of Thomas Ford, was the principal for the research. And so it was referred to as a Ford study, which was published looking at life, economics, social, all aspects of life in the Appalachian Mountain area. And so when this was published then, in 1962, we began to talk about how do we implement the findings of this, which then led to the creation of CORA, Commission on Religion in Appalachia, which I helped create, and then later I became the executive director. And our purpose, if you want something to bore you and put you to sleep, listen to these words. The stated purpose was to deal with the religious, moral, and spiritual implications inherent in the economic, social, and cultural conditions of the Appalachian region of the United States. Wouldn't that put you to bed? Would you want to join that kind of an organization? Would you donate to that kind of an organization? That was a consultative body that brought all different people together. I was accused of being a naive preacher. When we brought together in one room in Washington, D.C., the heads of most of the federal agencies in one room, and the director of the Appalachian Regional Commission said only a naive preacher could cause that to happen. I'll tell you a little bit more about that a little bit later. But we brought together from the religious sector all three levels, the national level, the state level, some call it diocese, some conferences, whatever the adjudicatory level is called, and local level, and got them all working together. And, you know, church bureaucracy, just like every other bureaucracy, everybody thought somebody had to sit on high and tell them what to do down at the grassroots. And so I developed an awareness very early because, as I said, working in the United States and Canada, and with a program budget of only $2,500, I was supposed to do something to help 5,000 rural congregations spread across that. Can you imagine? That was in 1964. Maybe it was worth a little bit more now, but it wasn't much. But I became convinced that I could not sit in an office in Indianapolis and pipeline anything down that would help any local community. So, being a farm boy from Oklahoma and still having a lot of frontier can-do in my blood, I decided, a real radical idea, you know, we need to sit down in the community and bring everybody together in their community and let them talk about what we can do, what we need, how we can improve our community, and how can the churches of our community help us. That was such a radical idea. And when I took that to my National Planning Committee, a grassroots strategy for ecumenical work, when denominations were all doing their own individual thing, and Max suggested you do it at the local level and that you do it with everybody involved, that was really radical. But that's how I got started in this business. After 41 years, this is what was said about Korah when they celebrated its life and put it to bed. Have you ever heard of an organization being birthed and then put to bed? It happened. They said Korah was founded in 1965 as a home for a broad range of Appalachian Christians to band together and to mobilize church support for labor, civil rights, environmental protection, and other vital causes. Our slogan came from Amos 5:23, "Let justice roll down like waters." And our mission was to express God's love through the empowerment of the people of Appalachia by working for justice. So that sounds a little bit more like what we were all about. But getting 18 denominations together, this was the first time the Roman Catholics had worked with anybody besides Catholics after Vatican II. We even had Southern Baptists working with us. And if there's any Lutherans in the room, you probably won't believe me when I tell you we had the Missouri Synod Lutherans working with us, but we did, sitting around the table. Methodist, Presbyterian, all of it. Of course, I would have been hung if I'd have served the real stuff from one of these glasses with Methodist and a few other teetotalers or those that went in the back door of the liquor store. But I discovered that there was a retreat house. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh, there's a retreat place up on the bluff, a Catholic retreat center. And so we could have our meetings up there, and they served anything that we wanted, you know. And I was on a Saturday morning, I saw people coming into my board meeting with carrying a Pepsi, one of those containers, Pepsi containers, you know. And I began to, several people would go out and come back, and I discovered there was a spigot in the hallway with a beer keg on the other side. So I didn't get hung for that. Well, let's talk a little bit about civil and human rights in Appalachia. When John Kennedy was campaigning for presidency, he discovered people in eastern Kentucky that he didn't know existed. It was a new world for him. And he made a commitment during that campaign to do something for these people. He formed, after he got into office, he formed a task force to look at Appalachia and figure out how they could help alleviate some of the poverty and work with the people there. And I'm told by the person that delivered it, a copy of our Southern Appalachian study that I mentioned was delivered to the White House to his desk. I was told they would always deny it and say he never got it. but he did. So that study helped shape the government's approach to Appalachia. The Appalachian Regional Commission was established, and that was a grand federal experiment growing out of Brookings Institute. That was one of the progressive think tanks back then. It was suggested that we needed to break the United States up into regions. And so Appalachia was the first region. Upper Great Lakes was another region, but Appalachia is where they concentrated on bringing the federal, the state, and the local governments together. The 13 governors had a staff in Washington. Don Whitehead was a friend of mine, and I worked closely with him. And then there was an Appalachian Regional Commission, an agency with a full staff, and we worked with Ralph Widener, the first director of that. And then what we know as COGS now, Councils of Government, Lynn, Benton, Lincoln County worked together. That's a COG. Well, that was a part of the grand design because they knew from the efforts to consolidate schools, they couldn't force communities to work together. And so they thought if they put communities together by counties and then began to put the money through those councils of government, they could begin to get them working together. And of course, it was a normal process, the brightest, the best proposal writers were the ones that got all the goodies. Just to put incompetence together does not make competence. I can give you many chapters and verses on that, but I can tell you that we had made a little difference in that process. And again, just like the Appalachian study, it wound up on JFK's desk. Nobody will ever get credit for this, but my office was in Knoxville, Tennessee. Got a phone call from a professor in charge of Graduate School of Economics at University of Tennessee and said, "Max, are you free for lunch today? I've got a student that's working on his doctorate in economics and would like to have a conversation with you." And I said, "Sure." We had a conversation, and out of that luncheon, we developed a proposal for a major study of the 30 hardcore counties in central Appalachia, looking at 20-some categories, and that was, for you computer geeks, that was back in the old days of the mainframe computer. And they did the factor analysis with all of those items. It cost me $300 to pay for the university's computer time, and that's all it cost me. I had a report, a study from Graduate School of Economics, laid on my desk. I went to Washington, sat down with my friend, Don Whitehead, who headed up the governor's part of the Appalachian Commission, and shared that with him. He took that study, made a personal visit to each of the 13 governors, and he convinced them and the whole agency to reallocate their funds based upon this study. A long story short, they took funds off of the top and set them aside for the neediest counties, and then allowed the writers of good proposals to jockey for the rest. But that made a difference in how federal funds were allocated. But it all came because we developed relationships. And then, of course, Kennedy was killed before the commission he had it underway, but didn't have it legislated yet. So President Johnson established the Appalachian Regional Commission that I've described. Johnson also started the Great Society and the War on Poverty. Some of you probably worked in that, I don't know. Any community action people that were involved in OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, I know Maury was involved in those kinds of things. But that too grew out of these efforts that we were doing. But there was a major fallacy that happened with the creation of the Appalachian Regional Commission and the War on Poverty. And that fallacy is because of the politics of the situation, they separated human development from economic development. So the Appalachian Regional Commission, the Economic Development Agency, predetermined the growth centers all across this 13-state region where they were going to put the big bucks in, where they were going to grow, in addition to building highways all across, and that was a good thing to open the region up with highways, but predetermined growth centers where they were going to put the investments. And then the War on Poverty was supposed to do the human development side. And, you know, they did many good things. I'm not saying negative, and there are good things. But to divide those two, so we saw what that was doing to people and to communities, and so we focused on human economic development. And some of the projects that I'm going to talk about grew out of that. Because we started at the head of the holla, working with communities, bringing people together, saying, what do you need? How can you improve your community? How can we help you? What resources do you need? All of those kinds of things that were happening with local communities. And then we proceeded to develop those projects. I used to joke with the director of the Appalachian Regional Commission. I said, you know, I've never seen a mink coat trickle down with your trickle-down economic theories. But said, we'll meet you somewhere between the head of the holla and your growth center. We'll meet you somewhere in between. When Bobby Kennedy was killed, they set up the Kennedy Memorial. There were 20 bright young people who shared the ideals of Bobby Kennedy. And I was fortunate to have 2 of those 20 assigned to work with me. One was a PhD economist, and the other was a community organizer and an organizer of credit unions. The PhD economist went into Clearfield County, Tennessee, assessed the needs and met with the people, and here were small acreages. The people had small acreages of timber, and the coal mining had kind of petered out there, and so they put together with Kelso's second income theory a co-op so that the timber owners could work in the co-op and get an income from wages and an income for the product that they sold. Is that a good idea, Dan? Okay. But the skill level, this was one of those counties where I worked that was classified, for those that classify, as functionally illiterate. Less than a 4th grade education. But if I was down and out and needed something, that's the first place I would go, because I learned the difference between education and wisdom. Those were smart folks. And they knew how to live. And so, and how to survive. But as we when we dedicated the pallet plant. There are two pieces I want to share out of this. Ethel Kennedy came down for the dedication. We took Ethel up as far as you could go in a four-wheel drive, and then we walked another mile or so. And there were a couple and one of them's wife, three people that lived back in a little log shack, played a violin, played a fiddle. We introduced her as our friend Ethel, and we practically had to literally drag her away from there because she was Ethel, our friend Ethel. She wasn't a Kennedy, she was an Ethel. And to see that happen in front of your eyes was amazing. The second thing, this is the project, one of the projects, that this naive preacher got the federal bureaucracy together in Washington. We laid out the project, and we said, now, we want you, Department of Economics, to give us this. We want Employment and Labor to give us this. So we had it all laid out for everyone. And the director of the Appalachian Regional Commission said, well, what you need is a top-notch guy to really run that operation. If you're really going to be a pilot, if you're going to get this off the ground, you've got to have top-notch. And we'll put $50,000 in for you to hire the best possible manager for that. Fortunately, I had my tape recorder going like Mila does here and recorded that. And as bureaucracies are wont to do, when we reminded them of that commitment, they had forgotten. Not only had they forgotten, but that executive director had gone off to work for Battelle Institute in Columbus, Ohio. And so the tape was transcribed. The tape was shared with the powers that be. And my former friend, Ralph Widener, came from Columbus, Ohio, back to Washington, D.C., sat in his former office, and he did the necessary paperwork to follow up on his commitment. You got to have fun, you know? If you're going to do this kind of work, you got to have fun. Oh, I forgot. I didn't even put that in the manuscript. I was the OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity, was a bit politicized. And when a new party got into Washington, they decided they were going to kill it. And they put in who they thought was one of their brightest young men to kill this radical organization that was doing community organizing all across the country. And I was asked to be on that new director's Rural Advisory Committee. So I would take a group of Appalachians to Washington, and we would go to his office, and he would roll out the red carpet. We're so glad to see you. Anything we can do for you people. On and on and on with that kind of you-know-what. Don Rumsfeld was very gracious and could do all kinds of things. And then he proceeded to send us to his executive assistant, who told us there was no way they could help us. They would never help us and send us home empty pocket, time and time again. That executive assistant's name was Dick Cheney. So I don't mean to be talking about any of your friends, but would you believe another one of the happenings in Yachats? One of my joys is sitting at the visitor center on Friday mornings. Last summer, I had a woman come in, and I always say, where are you visiting from? Well, I'm from Silver Springs, Maryland. And, oh, yeah, well, I had a friend that used to have the English Language Center in Washington, lived in Silver Springs. She said, well, I live next door to Donald Rumsfeld. and he's just got a new book out. Have you read it yet? She says. So I listened carefully. I didn't say a word about what I just told you. I even was interested enough to take the name of the book down. I've never ordered it, but anyway, she enjoyed Yachats, I hope, and I enjoyed making that connection. Well, out of our work in the alternative economic development, I mentioned the pallet plant that was a pilot. The organization called Human Economic Development provides Appalachian families with the opportunity for affordable housing, job creation, and the improvement and healthier communities. Now, thanks to internet and some friends that I emailed and said 40 years later, what's it like? There's a network of over 50 organizations that serve 6 states, and over 200,000 families have housing. They made over $469 million in direct investments, and they achieved a total accumulated financial impact of over $1 billion in the Appalachian region in the last 35 years. How do you think that made me feel to have had a little hand in kind of getting that started? Can you understand why I'm happy to share with you guys? And the other focus is the Appalachian Community Federal Credit Union. Some of you have heard us talk about credit union around Yachats. They have a membership of 30 of those same organizations involved in the HEAD project, and the entire population of the central Appalachian counties. And I looked at their balance sheet of their last year's annual report, and total assets of $174.5 million, with 7 branches, offices in Tennessee, Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, and then ATMs in a lot of other communities. And their primary mission is promoting community development. Now, is that something worth doing, do you think? I was proud of those folks, and that Bobby Kennedy intern with a little expertise of how to start a credit union. Things have happened. Well, we changed our strategy with Cora, and as we worked with more and more communities began to develop some strength within the communities, we developed the Appalachian Projects Committee. I spent about half of my time raising money from foundations and other sources for these communities. And we would bring 25, 30, 40 local groups together that had submitted a proposal requesting help from the Appalachian Projects Group for an overnight retreat. Here, everybody had put their proposal in, was coming ready to fight for it. And as they shared their needs in that kind of a retreat back in the mountains setting, and slept on it and heard from the others, we literally had several organizations every year that would withdraw their proposal and say, you know, we've been talking overnight, and we think we can find another $500,000 or $600,000, $500 or $600, not thousand, $100 in our budget, in our operation, to send over to that group because it needs it worse than we do. Can you believe that? Well, when I told the big boys in New York City, the foundations, they wouldn't believe it at all. They said it can't be done. But it did. it worked. Well, moving right along real fast. How many remember Buffalo Creek? Anybody? Does that ring a bell for anyone? Buffalo Creek, 1972. One of the deadliest floods in U.S. history occurred in southern West Virginia's Buffalo Creek Holler. Pittston Coal Company was a negligent strip mining company. A heavy rain produced a raging flood. It completely wiped out 14 communities. In a matter of minutes, 118 were dead, over 4,000 people were left homeless, and 7 were never found. 3 separate study commissions looked into this disaster: federal, state, and a citizens group. They found that the Buffalo mining had blatantly disregarded standard safety practices. And Pittston officials, though, called that flood an act of God. That slag heap dam, not an engineered dam, but a slag heap dam that they put their slag behind, had washed down, and that was an act of God. Reverend Charles Crum, a disabled miner from Buffalo Creek area, testified before the Citizens Commission. He said, "I never saw God drive the first slate truck up the holler. The Army Corps of Engineers cleaned it up. They cost about $3.7 million. The state of West Virginia negotiated with the federal government from the 70s until 1988, and finally agreed to repay $9.5 million to cover some of the costs. The state sued Pittston for $100 million, $50 million of which was earmarked to recoup the cost of the damages. Governor Arch Moore at that time was one of those governors probably in the pockets of the coal companies. You can decide, as I go ahead and tell you, that the $100 million suit, Arch Moore, 3 days before he left office, negotiated a settlement of $1 million. Numerous lawsuits were filed. The largest class action suit, some 600 survivors and family members and victims, sued Pittston for $64 million. They settled out of court for $13.5 million in 1974, each individual receiving an average of only $13,000. A 70-year-old man commented to a Pittston attorney, "I've often thought some of this stuff could have been avoided if someone would have just come around and said, here's a blanket, here's a dress for your wife, here's a sandwich. Would you like a cup of coffee?" But they never showed up. Nobody showed up to give us a place to stay. And Pittston Company never offered me a pair of pants to put on or a shirt. In 1978, an attempt to incorporate Buffalo Creek as a town failed by a vote of 816 to 514. You see, the incorporation would have allowed the city to be qualified for federal and state rehabilitation grants. But the coal companies opposed that so greatly because they did not want to be taxed with property tax. So it was not incorporated, so they had no property tax. The word was that the way many of those counties operated, the county assessor once a year would write corporate headquarters and ask for a contribution to provide services to their county. Can you imagine? Okay, well, it happened. Well, I want to take you one other place. The Brookside Mine. Have you ever heard of Duke Power in North and South Carolina? You're a friendly power company? Well, they owned, are you from there?
Yes,
Are you? Okay. Huh?
South Carolina.
South Carolina, okay. Duke Power owned coal mines in eastern Kentucky. And this was something else. In 1973, the workers at the Brookside Mine in Harlan County, Kentucky, voted 113 to 55 to replace their membership in the Southern Labor Union and join the United Mine Workers. The Southern Labor Union was pretty much an operator's influence, but they lost. And so the owners of the mine refused to sign new contracts with United Mine Workers for a local at Brookside. After a month of negotiations with no success, 180 miners went out on strike. After a 13-month-long strike, there was violence. The county judge, F. Bird Hogg, you ought to hear some of these Appalachians pronounce that name. He was a county judge, and he was a coal mine operator, or coal mine owner himself. He put an injunction on the miners so they couldn't, on the strikers. And so the women went to the picket line. They formed a little club, and there was over 100 women on the picket line. I remember visiting them on the picket line. 80-year-old Minnie said, "Max, I grabbed my broom this morning when I headed out, and I brought it, I stuck it in the fire because it was cold, they had a fire going to warm themselves, and got the brushes off the broom. So I've got me," she was prepared. And the word was that one of the black miners was going to be there, and the company thugs were going to shoot him at the picket line. And so Lois Scott showed me. She had her pistol, her blouse unbuttoned pistol, in her bra. And she had practiced how she was going to walk up to this guy who was going to shoot him and take a hold of him, pull him on her. She would fall backwards, and as they were falling backwards, she would get him. She had it planned. Well, it wasn't settled. A lot of violence. They set up a citizens' inquiry panel for the Brookside strike. It was chaired by former Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz. Senator Fred Harris was on it. There were 11 prominent people. I was honored to be one of those 11. To sit for 2 days in front of national TV and listen to the stories of the miners and their families. The mothers had the kids sleeping on the floor because their homes were being shot into at night. And if they were at bed level, the chances of being hit with that bullet was greater than if they were on the floor. Of miners talking about the working conditions. Oh, they had a showplace mine. Everything was up to snuff. And of course, the company always knew when OSHA was going to come and do the inspections. So all the miners had to shuffle over to the showplace mine to be on duty when the inspectors came. But the working place was about 48 inches high with 12 inches of water and 400 volts of electricity. And that was the working condition. We listened to that. Walter Cronkite's associate told me, he said, Max, I walked into a gun shop in Harlan. I could have bought as many 45 caliber submachine guns with silencers on as I wanted. It wasn't until one of the mine supervisors, his name was Billy Bruner, shot and killed a 23-year-old striker. And that created a groundswell of concern. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't until the miners went to Duke's headquarters in North Carolina, and then they went with their mining equipment to Wall Street and told people what was happening. And when they started dumping Duke stock, it was settled immediately. But that's not the rest of the story. Of course, you can imagine my being in that struggle and with those people and on that panel, I was clear up to here with stress. Had a friend that had a cabin for summer in Narragansett, Rhode Island. So they invited me to come up and use their cabin that summer for a week. I went up in August of 1974. As I got out off the airport, off the plane and crawled in the back of a taxi, the newspaper headline said, Doris Duke pours, I don't remember how many hundreds of thousands of dollars into the city of Narragansett. As I'm wont to do once in a while, nose around a little, you know, you can learn a lot in local bars. And I discovered that Doris Duke, the Duke family had one of those big mansions in Narragansett. Her lover was her chauffeur. And as the lover got out of the limousine to go open the gate, she slipped over under the wheel, ran over him, killed him, and then promised the town that if they wouldn't prosecute, she would pump as much money into the city as she could get her hands on. And so off of the backs of those coal miners in Kentucky and the profits that they were making, money's coming to cover up the sins of this person. Connections. Connections. Isn't that what it's all about? That's the rest of the story. Well, much more I could tell you about Appalachian coal fields, but I won't. But you get a sense of how coal was dominant and continues to be. I was looking at an email from a friend, Father John Roush, in his year-end letter last year, shared some of the things he was involved in. He says, I'm really proud to have been a part of the group that was able to raise some ethical issues with Peabody Coal and some of the other coal companies that had created a shell corporation called Patriots and had shuffled all of their commitments for miners' retirement pay, black lung pay, all of this stuff had shuffled over to this shell corporation, and then they bankrupted to shed themselves of all of that responsibility. And they were able to get a little bit of help, a little bit back in that. Well, that's coal fields. That doesn't happen where we lived, is it? We don't have any of those kind of things happen here. That's all back there.
Timber.
But I went from Appalachia to Buffalo, New York. Less than 24 hours after arriving in Buffalo, the federal judge, John Curtin's decision on school desegregation came down. And my first task as founding director of BAM, the new Buffalo Area Metropolitan Ministries, a again with all religious groups, including Catholic and Jewish, working together, was to deliver a press release that first day saying, we'll keep it cool, we'll be good. We won't be like Boston. I remember when Boston was blowing up at the same time. Louisville, the Justice Department and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission both came into Buffalo, checked it out, came to me privately and said, this is going to be more violent than Boston or Louisville in Buffalo. We need somebody to work behind the scenes to keep things cool, and we think you're it. Scared the hell out of me. And I'd only been in town such a short period of time. By that time, probably a month or 2 months maybe. Of course, front page newspapers talked about the carpetbagger that had come to Buffalo. But I accepted the job. And we did keep it cool. And just a couple of things in terms of how we did this kind of work in that setting and how different it was for me from Appalachia. The federal judge appointed me chair of the Citizens Monitoring Committee. We had the strongest leaders in all the ethnic groups on that committee. We were the eyes and ears for the judge out in the community. And he asked me to have lunch with him once a week. So he would toss me an order and said, Max, here's a draft. I'm thinking about this order. What do you think? Do you have any suggestions? And as we worked together over a period of time, he would say, Max, I need an order for such and such. Would you draft me one? So for a social justice activist that was used to pounding on somebody's desk or doing whatever was necessary to get the bureaucracy's attention, being on the inside, working directly with the judge was a new day for me, and some new earnings, and a whale of a lot of responsibility. But then you see the school system wasn't that trustworthy, at least some people thought. And so CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act director, talked to me and said, Max, we want to provide some people to help with the school desegregation. Would you let us give them to you, to your agency, to work in the schools? I said, well, with only a couple conditions. I get to hire and fire, and I get special money for management people, get good people. Many of them were teachers. We hired 150 people who were bus aides, teachers' aides in school. To make a long story short, we kept it cool, and Buffalo, according to the New York Times, I just discovered, I didn't know it while I was still there, was known as the model integration program. Because you see, we formed magnet schools. And so rather than all of the 30,000 students being bused in ways that they didn't want to be bused, we had magnets for the kids to come to. And so that was another experience. I'd like to tell you about the farm crisis, but I see our time's getting down here. Some of you are getting restless. You want to hear something about farm crisis? Yeah. Do you? Are you still with me? Can I get another champagne glass here? Well, you probably heard about the farm crisis in the 1980s. I'd gone back to Oklahoma from Buffalo to head up the State Ecumenical Agency in 1979. And 1982 or 3, triple whammy hit Oklahoma. The oil business went bust. Anyone remember Penn Square Bank? Penn Square Bank in Oklahoma City was the first bank to go under with the domino effect. And Oklahoma had more bank closures per capita than any other state. Texas had actually more banks, but they had a larger population base. And then we had farm foreclosure. Willie Nelson gave us $25,000 from his first farm aid to set up a farm crisis hotline, AgLink. We were processing about 1,000 calls a month from distressed farmers. We documented over 500 lives that we saved from suicide. We organized teams of clergy and farmers all across the state, 77 counties in each of the counties. And they would keep the caller on the phone as long as possible and try to get some of those people to them. We didn't save them all. We were the first state in the nation to set up a farmer creditor mediation program and have it certified. The economic downturns of the 70s and 80s, where the appraised value of land was lower than the loan price. I had many farmers tell me about going to a farm sale, and the staff from the farm credit system would stand by them and nudge them and say, hey, buy it, bid on it, we'll finance it, we'll give you the money, bid on it, buy it. And they would. And they were in trouble then. Then, a classic that I remember was a fellow who had been a county sheriff. He had an operating loan from Farmers Home Administration. Farmers Home Administration, provided loans in advance for your operation. You had to present and get a budget approved. Well, he presented his plan. He needed something like $50,000 for his operation for the next year. And so then when he went back in to settle up and take his papers back in, there were expenses that were not approved in that budget. There were hospital bills for a pregnant wife who delivered. That wasn't approved in his budget. He lost his farm and was foreclosed on by FHA because of that illegal transaction. I could go on all night talking about those kinds of things, but you got to have fun when you're doing this kind of work. So when I was asked to come to Washington, when they had a federal moratorium on farm foreclosures, supposedly there were no foreclosures going on. I was asked to come and testify to the Senate Ag Committee, and I had the lawyer on my staff go through my testimony very carefully because I knew it would be scrutinized. We knew from those 1,000 calls a month on the hotline how many foreclosures were happening and still happening, even with the moratorium. And so I went to Washington, took a farmer along with me and a young woman who was on the staff of the Oklahoma Attorney General's staff. And she'd never been to Washington and had all these images of being big time in Washington. At that time, the best place to eat in Washington was in the cafeteria at the Supreme Court building. So I took them over for breakfast. As we were standing in line, this old white-haired gentleman came up and, who are you guys? What are you doing? And so I told him, gave him a copy of my testimony. And we noticed as we went in to eat, here sitting at the next table next to us was Justice White and his entire staff going through my testimony. So that afternoon, as I came to testify, of course, the farm credit lawyers with their suits and all on had reserved the front row seats. And so I shared in a loud enough voice I intended them to hear that the Supreme Court already had my testimony. You got to have fun, Of course, that testimony was shared by noon the next day. It was in all the farm states. And the next day, an auditor from the State Department of Agriculture was in my office going through stuff that he had no right to go through. But anyway, that's the way the system works. Well, we did some good. We saved a lot of lives, but there's still a lot of pain out there. Now, one of the hardest things I've done in speech making for a long time was to narrow this all down and just choose a few little bits to share with you. But I want to close by sharing some lessons learned from social justice work. And you could add, it would be fun to have all of you participate in fleshing these out, but this just kind of scratches the surface. First lesson learned, it's all about power. Do you agree? Yes. Can you say that with me? It's all about power. That's right. My friend Cy Kahn wrote a little book and used to talk about two kinds of power. There's money power and there's people power. And a lot of our work was trying to get enough people power to equalize and to make a dent with the money power. My experience as a farm boy from Oklahoma did not include unions. I didn't know what a union was until I went to Appalachia. Jock Yablonsky had been murdered. Remember that? United Mine Workers? We had probably $90,000 to $100,000 in Arnold Miller's $200,000 campaign for United Mine Workers president, and he won. You can imagine where I was when they had United Mine Worker conventions. I was sitting on his platform. And so I got to see unions from the inside. And I won't, there's a lot of bad stuff, but there's a lot of good stuff. And the ability of workers to unionize and work together, Barbara, am I right? Brings a lot of power. And there has been major efforts in our society for the last 30 years to de-unionize. And I'm sorry to say that that campaign was started by the editor of the Daily Oklahoman in Oklahoma City. That put his wealth and stuff out to try to get rid of unions. Well, as that has gone down, as unions have become weaker and lost their negotiating power, the corporate power has increased. Right? At least that's my take. A second lesson learned. Another friend said that if you're going to bring about major social change, you've got to have people in the outhouse, the hellraisers, raising hell in the outhouse. Right, Maury? And Susan. Get some community organizers in here that I know will agree with me. You've got to have the outhouse hellraisers, but you've got to have in-house workers too. So you've got to be working both. And so I learned that very clearly in those desegregation days of working with Federal Judge John Curtin, how important and how much a difference you can make sometimes if you are on the inside and working with people on the inside as well as on the outside. Yachats probably doesn't know why Marie, my beloved of 31 years, kept her name. She's Marie Green. But when she made the front page of the Washington Post picketing against apartheid in South Africa, Max Glenn didn't lose his job in Oklahoma. Right? A third observation. The former Secretary of the Department of Church and Economic Life of the National Council of Churches became the United Methodist Board of Missions Chief Executive. He spoke at one of our core meetings. He talked about overcoming cruelty with love. And he made the strong point that we're all a part of cruelty systems. And cruelty systems do cruel things to people. They don't walk up, you wouldn't walk up and hit somebody in the face, but you might be a part of a cruelty system that's doing a lot more than bloodying someone's nose. And he suggested that until love is manifested through the economic, political, and social systems, we will manifest our lives in some very cruel ways. And I think that was a lot more prophetic today than it was in 1967 when he made that statement.
Could you repeat that
And
statement
finally,
about love?
pardon?
Max, could you repeat that statement about love?
Repeat the statement about love.
Okay. Cruelty systems do cruel things to people until love is manifested through economic, political, and social systems. We will manifest our lives in some cruel ways. Thank you. Well, and I conclude with the power of the corporations today are even stronger than they were when I worked in the 1960s. My dream for the future, I want to start with 2 reforms. First of all, I want the Supreme Court to reverse itself and declare that corporations are not people. And second, I want money out of politics. I want to utilize the technology for people to participate in decision making. I don't know what shape or how that can happen, but we've got the technology. It could happen if we can think outside of the box and find ways we could participate in the decision making. We don't need the Koch brothers or anybody else determining our life and what happens for our future. I'm excited about the future. I know the human spirit is resilient, and I'm looking for great things, even more. My staff used to say I had rose-colored glasses, but I don't know. I affirm the growing awareness and consciousness of how connected we are to this planet. We used to talk about 6 degrees of separation. I think that's much less now, isn't it, Terry? What is it? I like the Yachats City Council's 7th generation thinking. My life's work has been to inspire personal greatness in others while growing spiritually on my journey. From a very early age, I have been about the task of pulling together ideas, possibilities, and people, helping each person that I encounter to excel mentally, physically, spiritually, and artistically, so that together we may make a contribution for the common good, that we can be the change that we want to see in our world, as Gandhi stated. This passion, this passionate desire to help others has connected me with some really awesome people over these 50 years. And thus, 31 years ago, I took on Marie's little corporation she had called Connections Unlimited, connecting people to make a difference in the lives, their personal lives, and the lives of the community. So that's what I'm about. Thank you for letting me share these stories with you. I'm open to questions if anyone wants to ask any questions. Our time's getting late.
Max?
Is this a rebuttal?
You gotta tell a story about the potties, the toilets that,
The Anna-John toilets?
yeah. Short, but
Oh, I'll be short. Well, what she's remembering, CBS News came down to do a documentary on our work in Appalachia. And so we were in Southwest Virginia, and I took the producer into a hardware store and asked to borrow a new toilet stool. I said, "We'll bring it back in about an hour." You see, the producer wanted to set that new toilet stool beside a slanting outdoor john for the visuals, to describe the add-a-john project that Cora had of adding indoor plumbing to those mountain shacks. One Sunday afternoon in my living room, a staff person from Vita, who worked overseas and helping get appropriate technology into some of those countries he was working with. We sat in my room, dreamed up this project, and he got his pencil out and drew out and designed. We took an old school bus. We cut one side out of that school bus and laid it down so that became a platform where we could roll the saws and all the equipment out on that platform and work on it. Of course, we had a generator there, and so it was all self-contained. Well, as wont to be, some Presbyterian church in Montclair, New Jersey, that thought that was a real neat idea, and the men's group really wanted to put some money into that. They didn't want us having an old school bus. They bought a brand new van, fancy van, and put our name on the outside, delivered it down to Tennessee. It was practically useless because we couldn't lay the side down. We had to take all the equipment out before we could use it. But anyway, you do what you can. And those 200,000 families that got housing, some of the people got a start with the Attic John project. Well, thank you, Marie. This quilt was given to me by the people of Appalachia to thank me for my work. It was developed by the Model Valley Mountain Crafts Group, and they also made this little banner. This is one of the favorite sayings, "Stay with us a spell." It is certified thanks to Nan Scott and her quilt group. It is now registered nationally, and I had the honor of naming it. It's Appalachian Fire. That's special. Somewhere packed away, unpacked, it's not unpacked, is a nice plaque that when I was in Buffalo, New York, Benjamin Hooks was the executive director of the NACP. He made a trip to Buffalo to recognize and give me a national award for community service. That was important to me. But most important to me is this. It says, the Golden Cuckleburr Award. These are cuckleburrs with cotton. Maxie Glenn, 1989. And on the back, this was Oklahoma farmers, creativity. Some of those farmers, 3,000 farmers that drove their tractors to the tractorcade to Washington. They said, rough as a cuckleburr, but soft as a ball of cotton. Thanks for planting your boot firmly on the back side of the Farm Credit Boys, American Agriculture. Thank you. That's your question. Okay.
Yes, you mentioned having the Supreme Court reverse its decision making corporations people, but there has to be a process to get that there. Do you have any ideas on how we could get that started? Because frankly, yes, that needs to
Well,
happen.
I can't think of anything better to come out of Yachats than that process. And we've got the creativity here. You want to convene us?
I'd love to. I think we've created absolute evil with the idea of corporations. All powerful and no accountability.
That's right. Yep. Okay. Yvonne, you look like you got a question. No?
Well, I have a question, but of a little different sort. You were working in some volatile communities in times that were not friendly to the ideas that you were advocating. Did you ever feel threatened personally?
I had staff being shot at, run off the road. I didn't carry a gun, but I carried a flashlight that was long and heavy that could be used if I needed. Probably the most scared I was in Pikeville, Kentucky, when the nurses' aides in a hospital with 6 floors, nurses' aides were being forced to administer narcotics and do the nurses' work in surgery because there wasn't a single RN in that entire hospital. They went on strike. We were supporting the strikers. One of my staff was going up regularly, working with them. And, of course, they appreciated it. And I was invited to stay in the home of one of the women that was kind of one of the ringleaders. And so when I arrived at their house next to the railroad track, there was Tiny was, what kind of dog was Tiny? Doberman. A Doberman pinscher tied to the front door. And so I waited till somebody got home to handle that Doberman pinscher. So I was welcomed in, fed a great meal, just really great. And I was shuffled off to a son's bedroom at the front of the house, near the front door. And the husband, who was on the local police force, he was a narc agent for the Pikeville Police. Some of his friends came by, and I could still, in this small house, I could overhear the conversation. They thought I'd gone to sleep. They were planning the firebombing of those strikers' homes for the next night. Here was the friendly policeman whose wife was the strike leader firebombing, and I discovered he was the leader of the Klan too. But after hearing that conversation, Yvonne, going to sleep was not easy. But I did. I got to sleep. All at once, I had that sense there's a presence in the room. I opened my eyes, and here was that dog looking right down at me. So that was probably the most scary night. Yeah.
Did you do any union organizing? Because I know in the places I've been...
I didn't do organizing.
Okay.
We supported organizers, but I didn't.
I know that the infractions against the companies that subvert organizing are so meager compared to the profit they make from keeping the workers ununionized. It's really in their best interest to continue that.
That's right. Well, Lawrence?
We was farming in the 70s and 80s, and we survived them years. There was some lot of tough years in there. But then what we found out was we had to be careful of was the farm home and the FHA and the lenders would lend you out of business.
That's right.
One time we wanted a loan, we wanted $48,000. They said, come back about a month later, they said, well, we have approved you, but we decide you need $248,000. I said, what am I going to do with the money? He said, I don't care what you do with it. But we didn't take the loan.
And he was probably getting a commission off of that loan too, personal commission.
But that's what was going on like that.
I know.
Just like the housing crisis, we had to drop 1.7 years ago and that. I
Well-
don't know why people,
We had farmers with the bank foreclosures. We had farmers whose loans were not delinquent, had never been delinquent, but when the bank went under, all agriculture loans were considered bad, and they were thrown immediately to foreclosure. So we had people losing their land who were not even delinquent with their loan.
The loans weren't sold like they were later.
No.
They were just.
No. Anyway, we could go on and on, but thank you for coming.